just for fun. And so this month we're really excited to talk about youth and teen homelessness, specifically institutional causes and proven solutions. Each of our education series, we really try to take the time to spend an hour and 15 minutes to really dig into one topic and homelessness or one special population and be able to really get some local experts and be able to talk at length. Before we get started, just want to start with our usual housekeeping. This is a Zoom presentation, and so certain things to keep in mind. First off, if you would like to use captions, if you just go down to the bottom of your screen and hit the CC, show captions, you'll be able to hear captions. This event is in English. We don't have any Spanish translation today. It was not requested, so it will be English captions and they will be generated. Our agenda today is the way it usually is, not every time, but most times. We'll have a data presentation that really sets the table, sets the scene for what we're going to talk about today. And then we'll do our panel with planned questions that we have. And then finally, we'll have a Q&A at the end where we ask questions of our panelists that folks have put in the Q&A feature. Because we're in webinar mode, that means any attendees, you have to use the Q&A function to add a question, but you can use the chat function to connect. So please do so and chat there. If you are an attendee, your camera and your microphone will be off. The session is recorded. We do put it on YouTube. We put it online, usually the day after the event, sometimes the following week, so that folks who can't make it in person are able to attend. So just like to let folks know that it's recorded. And then if you are a dual screen person and you want to be watching on this one and then online with your phone or secondarily, tweeting, Xing, whatever we may call it these days, please feel free to tag us at Co-Coalition, and our other partners are listed below. Once we go off this screen, if you want them back, let us know. We can put them in the chat, and you can use the hashtag CCHEdSeries. So now what I'll do is I'll go ahead and pass this along to my colleague, Andrew West, who is our data guru and who puts together a lot of really great information for these sessions, and is going to tell us about our emphasis today on youth, teens, unaccompanied minors, and homelessness. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Alexis. Good evening, everyone. My name is Andrew West, he, him pronouns. I'm the policy associate with Colorado Coalition for the Homeless. I'm going to see if I can get Data Guru added to my business cards, though, because that is a new one, and I actually am a fan of that. I'll be giving a bit of a data presentation to kick us off and make sure we're all on the same page as we head into our panel. Tonight, we are talking about youth and teens experiencing homelessness. And I want to give a quick note on families experiencing homelessness, as this is a bit of a separate population, but is definitely relevant when we talk about this population. And just a note on data, a family is generally defined as a household with both an adult over the age of 18 that also has a dependent under the age of 18. And this is something we've gone deeper into in our September 22 education series that focus specifically on family homelessness and the unique challenges that that population faces. But some data from 2023, 29% of people experiencing homelessness were in a family. That is across the United States. Almost 200,000 people in the country, and about 9 in 10 of families were sheltered. So this population is much more likely to be having access to shelter. And in Colorado, there are about 2,190 children under the age of 18 and 222 youth between the age of between the age of 18 and 24 who experience homelessness as part of a family. So there are certainly a lot of youth and teens who are experiencing homelessness as part of a family. But in general, in this session, we'll be speaking about what are often referred to as unaccompanied youth and teens and young adults. I'll be giving a lot of different data sources here, and I think it's worth noting that young adults generally, although it can be a bit different from source to source, young adults generally describes people between the ages of 18 to 25 who are often not encompassed in a family. So who are not living in a family that's both an adult and a dependent child. This is, of course, not to say that unaccompanied youth and teens are not part of families in the more colloquial definition, in the way that we use it every day. But just a note on definitions. In 2023, the 2023 annual homelessness assessment report, which is published every year to Congress. This is a nationwide count, mostly built off point in time data, which we've covered in previous presentations, found about a little over 100,000 people under the age of 18 who are experiencing homelessness, and 47,000 between the ages of 18 and 24. Um, the total number of people experiencing homelessness is about 653,000, so a small percentage, uh, but still large number nonetheless. Um, Another study, prevalence and correlates of youth homelessness in the United States. This is a 2018 study that goes a bit more in depth into data and looks at a couple different types of definitions, looks at couch surfing, it takes a bit of a more broad definition, found about 660,000 households where there is a 13 to 17-year-old in that household and they're experiencing homelessness. If you zoom out a bit more, look at 18 to 25-year-olds, there are about 3.5 million individuals in 2.4 million households who are experiencing homelessness. So if you take a bit of a broader definition and talk about people who are not just on the street, but also perhaps couch surfing or living in a motel or other places that are not a house or apartment that they rent, the number is much larger there. Thank you very much. So, who are we talking about with unaccompanied youth? Unaccompanied youth are generally, again, not defined as not part of a family or accompanied by a parent or guardian. A lot of the data sources will describe this population as runaway youth as well. And I think it's worth noticing, worth noting that there are really different challenges and circumstances compared to youth in families who are experiencing homelessness. Um, Again, we've talked about that population in the past, and today we'll be mostly focusing on unaccompanied youth and teens. Uh, Unaccompanied youth make up about a fifth of the population of people who are experiencing homelessness that are under the age of 25. Um, so not the majority of the population under 25, but certainly a very large number. And they are more likely to experience unsheltered homelessness. You'll remember from that slide before, I mentioned that people in families are about 9 in 10 of those are sheltered. So this would be about 6 in 10 are sheltered. So a smaller number who are able to access shelter. And there's also there's a strong connection between unaccompanied youth in shelters and experiences of domestic violence or gender-based violence. A bit more note on data, Colorado point in time count. Every year, this is a count on a single night of people who are experiencing homelessness. It looks at those who are sheltered as well as those who are unsheltered. In 2022, there were about 10,000 people overall, of which 453 were unaccompanied youth. And 72 of these 453 individuals were experiencing unsheltered homelessness. That number increased. There was a 35% increase overall in homelessness for unaccompanied youth between 2022 and 2023. This accompanied a larger increase overall for the entire population. So it is not really specific to this population, but emblematic of trends across the board. But we see that in 2023, there was actually a much larger number of unaccompanied youth who were experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And this is, again, in Colorado specifically. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So when we talk about causes, obviously at the coalition, we talk about the real strong connections between housing and homelessness, identifying that homelessness is at its core a housing crisis, and that remains true for this population. But we want to focus on a bit more specific causes that are unique to unaccompanied youth and teens. One can be the lack of supportive relationships and safe environments. We know that it's really important for children and youth to have these supporting relationships and environments as they grow. One commonly cited reason that people say that they became homeless was due to a family conflict or disagreement. So obviously there can be a whole host of things that lead to family conflict. But one survey found that family dynamics generally, their sexual orientation or sexual activity, or sharing this with a member of their family, as well as school problems, substance abuse, were really associated with family conflict. Again, there can be a lot of different sources, different causes, and this depends on the person, but these are some often cited reasons that people became homeless. I'll also note that there's a significantly higher risk of homelessness among youth who are Black or Hispanic, as well as those who have a child who are parenting, those with less than a high school diploma, those who are part of the LGBTQ community, those in foster care, or have experiences in the juvenile justice system. Again, young parents, especially those who are unmarried, were much more likely to become unhoused, as well as those with less than a high school degree. Um, we've talked again about the strong links between education and homelessness, as well as a whole host of other factors. 42% of young people who experience homelessness do so on repeat instances. So, a lot of the times when we talk to our clients at the coalition, those who have experienced long periods of homelessness have also done so when they were younger, when they were youth. So, it's important, again, when we look at solutions to um, provide support and provide resources when people are young to avoid prolonged experiences and future experiences of homelessness down the line. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. I mentioned some discrepancies within other populations. Youth of color, in particular, Black youth, face an 83% higher risk of experiencing homelessness than their white peers. It is a 33% increased risk for Hispanic youth. These are both groups that we have covered in previous Ed series, so I definitely encourage you to check that out and some more research on specific populations. But they also are more likely to spend a longer time unhoused than their white counterparts. So we know that the longer experiences of homelessness lead to a whole host of negative health outcomes and an increased risk of re-entering homelessness later on in life. For LGBTQ youth, they are more than twice as likely to experience homelessness as well. So a lot of these discrepancies that we see across populations are replicated for this group. There's also a really strong connection between foster youth. About 600, almost 600,000 children and youth are in foster care each year across the country, and about 20,000 are exiting the foster care system each year. Uh, Unfortunately, it's way too common for people exiting the foster care system to enter into homelessness. And we know that people who have spent time in foster care have also experienced homelessness. About half of the 17-year-olds in the foster care system are estimated to have some time that they are homeless before the age of 21. And lastly, in Colorado, about 28% of foster youth have experienced homelessness over the last 2 years. So really high numbers there, and something we'll talk about in solutions and with our panel later on. The justice system, we've talked a lot about criminal legal involvement, and that was our Ed Series focus last month, I believe, when we talked about grants passed and criminalization. One study showed that about 46, almost half of the youth who experienced homelessness had also been in a youth detention facility, jail, or prison recently. And this is much higher, about 3 times higher than the general population. So we know that interactions with the criminal legal system are likely to lead to a cycle of incarceration where becoming incarcerated makes it harder to access a lot of things like housing, healthcare, employment that are required to stay housed. And when you experience homelessness, you're also more likely to become incarcerated as well. So it's a cycle that is important to break. There are also some offenses specific to age, like breaking curfew. One thing I actually did not know in doing research for this presentation is that over 400 towns and cities across the United States have active youth curfew laws. And these are just tied to age. So this is generally being out after 10, 11 p.m. or midnight while you're under the age of 18, which is, again, generally not a crime for people who are adults and of legal age, but specifically criminalizes age in that way. And this is like what we talked about for people experiencing homelessness. Generally, having a criminal record just makes it so much harder to access other services. Next slide, please. Thank you. When we look at impacts of experiencing homelessness for youth, there's a high vulnerability to drug use, sexual exploitation, or developing or even having existing pre-health conditions worsen while experiencing homelessness. People are also more likely to experience mental health crises and substance use disorders than the general population once they become unhoused. Again, this is something we've talked a lot about, that having those experiences of homelessness and sleeping on the street can be so difficult that it can lead to developing those conditions, even if you didn't have one of those conditions before. About 3/4 of unhoused youth experience major trauma and are more likely to miss school, drop out at higher levels. Again, as I mentioned earlier, they have a much higher likelihood of experiencing homelessness later on in life, and unfortunately have higher rates of early death and suicide compared to their peers who are housed. So there's a whole host of negative impacts, and uh, these worsen the longer someone is experiencing homelessness generally. So I am always the Debbie Downer on these presentations. I would like to end on a more positive note, and I'm sure our panel will talk about some solutions as well. But generally, affordable housing, alleviating housing instability, making sure that we have housing that is safe, affordable, and accessible, as well as supporting families and addressing family trauma is important for ending youth homelessness. Improving educational systems, making sure that youth can stay connected. A lot of times, when people become disconnected from support networks and educational systems, that can lead to instability in various different ways. Um, there's a specific program, the Foster Youth Independence Voucher Program, that is a targeted intervention that provides housing vouchers for youth exiting the foster system. And we could do a lot to expand that, provide more resources and education around that program. And generally, we always talk about reducing stigma, guilt, and shame associated with experiences of homelessness. This is especially the case for youth who are obviously still developing. And lastly, providing resources during times of crisis. This is a point where youth are likely to face a lot of challenges, and if they aren't offered resources and support, it can lead to hard times and even potentially experiences of homelessness. So we've got a lot of solutions, and I will pass it back to Alexis to introduce our great panel.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Yeah, so I'd love to introduce our panelists today. I'll go ahead and give you a bit of information on everyone, and then we'll get started. First, we have Sarah Barnes. Sarah is the Senior Director of Policy and Director of Family Economic Prosperity Policy for the Colorado Children's Campaign. The Colorado Children's Campaign is a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization committed since 1985 to realizing every chance for every child in Colorado. They advocate for the development and implementation of data-driven public policies that improve child well-being in child and family health, youth success, early childhood, and family economic prosperity. So welcome, Sarah. Next, we have Ashley Garcia Torres. She is the Policy Fellow Coordinator at the Young Aspiring Americans for Social and Political Activism, or YASPA, and Leaf Fellow with the National Center for Youth Law. In addition to these roles, she serves as a board director at both AUL Denver and Stride Community Health Center. The National Center for Law the National Center for Youth Law believes in the incredible power, agency, and wisdom of youth. For more than 50 years, this organization has worked to center the voices and experiences of youth blocked from educational, health, and social well-being opportunities, particularly Black youth and youth of color, LGBTQ youth, disabled youth, immigrant youth, and youth in the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. Welcome, Ashley. Next, we have Benjamin Kinghorn, who is the Director of Shelter Services for Urban Peak. Urban Peak ignites the potential in youth to exit homelessness and create self-determined, fulfilled lives. The organization provides youth ages 12 to 24 who are at risk or currently experiencing homelessness with essential services such as shelter, strength-based and trauma-informed case management, and connections to education, employment, and well-being services. Welcome, Benjamin. And finally, we have Philip Roybal, who is the Director of Community and Policy Advocacy at Fully Liberated Youth. The mission of Fully Liberated Youth is to holistically resource and empower young people who are experiencing oppression, trauma, gang involvement, or system involvement so they can continue becoming the liberated individuals our communities need. Philip also serves as the co-lead on the youth justice team in Colorado for the National Center for Youth Law. So welcome, Philip. So I'm going to start our panel like we always do. And if y'all want to come off on screen, great. I'm going to start how we always do. We like to stop. I know that the data can be a lot all at once, and so now that you've seen the data presentation, is there anything that surprised you or anything that we missed on this topic that sort of sets the stage for what we're going to talk about today? And that's to anyone.
I guess I'll jump in real quick. One thing we've seen over the past year is also unaccompanied youth coming into Denver that may not have a parent or legal guardian in the country, coming from other countries in our migrant youth. And so I can resonate with a lot of those statistics, and there's a lot of support I can add to those things. But one thing I think I didn't really see much of is we're seeing a lot higher amount of kids, especially under 18, coming into the country without like a parent or legal guardian with them as well. And maybe they come here with a family member that doesn't work out, and now they're
Mhm.
without family on the streets and end up in a shelter.
Thank you so much, Ben. And not to get off topic, but if you want to speak more to that, we can start there. Because yeah, we didn't have that in our presentation, but we did do a session a few months ago on migrants and homelessness, and we know that a lot of the services here in Denver or in Colorado were not designed for that population, be that language services or age services or whatever it may be. So, at Urban Peak, are you experiencing like having to pivot in a way to respond to that?
Yeah, and we have a great case management team that is trying to address those needs, which aren't your typical kind of needs. We work with some of our youth in terms of just getting vital documents and those sort
Mhm.
of things. So it's more of like how to help support them kind of navigate independence in this way of being successful in Denver right now. Um, and yeah, it gets especially complicated when you're working with youth under 18 in terms of um just because they are under 18, we still want to have some sort of parental consent or guardian permission, or just to let somebody, a family member know that they're staying in a shelter. And so it's hard with um, potential language barriers, and also we're asking questions to the youth sometimes, and they might get nervous about, if we're asking about their mom's information or dad or wherever that, then they kind of get skeptical about why we're asking for that information. But yeah, but we're able to kind of build good relationships and help them understand kind of we're just trying to help support them and um, allow them to be able to stay in our space. And yeah, we've had some pretty good success.
Thank you. Anyone else on data points that stuck out or something that was missing that you think we should add to the conversation? Okay. Andrew usually does a great job with the data. So, I'm not surprised there was only one thing. So, if anything comes to mind, please feel free to jump in and, we can always take the conversation where it goes.
Yeah,
Um,
and I'll just add two more
yes.
little things in terms of the youth that we do see at the shelter. We definitely see higher represented LGBTQ youth, especially at the young adult shelter, 18 to 24. Kind of like when they turn 18, parents are like, well, there's the door if they don't accept their identity. So I think that's a huge part of why there's a higher increase. We also see a very disproportionate amount of Black youth in our shelter. Close to 40% are Black or biracial, which is not the demographic of Denver. So that's an unfortunate, disproportionate number of youth that are staying in our shelter as compared to just the population of Denver.
Thank you so much, Ben. Yeah, I think that one of the themes that comes up in that data presentation, which my apologies, I forgot to mention, anyone who registered for this, we will send that data presentation out. So you can get all that data and the sources at your fingertips. But one of the things that comes up is just how unaccompanied youth, I mean, homelessness in general, the population is different than the population at large in key ways. But in unaccompanied youth, it's really clearly in particular areas such as LGBTQ, justice involvement, um, children of color, and then particularly Black children. So there's a lot of identities and intersections, race, gender, system involvement. And so I just sort of a general question is, how does this impact the work that your organizations do that you work for, or maybe the emphasis of your organizations as they are created? So if anyone would like to jump in on that one.
I can just add there. So the Children's Campaign works more broadly to support child well-being across a number of areas. And many times we're looking at children as they exist within their family structure as well, their family of origin or their family that they're living with. But in those cases too, I think much of our policy work is done through a lens of equity, and it's often true that among many of the indicators that we work on and look at, we're seeing those same kind of disparities. So whether it's kids who are experiencing poverty, whether it's families facing eviction, whether it's access to healthcare, childcare, what school you go to, I think unfortunately the way our policies and systems in our country are designed, that is often the result. And so I think it's really important to talk about those disparities whenever we're talking about any of these issues.
Yeah, I will also just add really quick for Urban Peak, we value hiring staff with lived experience, and that can also represent the clients that we serve. So we always are trying to help find staff that can help represent our population. So there's more kind of representation among staff working with youth, so they kind of help and bridge that gap as well.
And I would love for you to add more, Philip, as I speak. But at National Center for Youth Law, a great majority of people who work there have also been system engaged. And so they can relate more directly towards our young people that are also system engaged. We also have a specific emphasis on serving people of color and marginalized communities, very simply because they experience these systems differently than white counterparts. And specifically within the LEAF Fellowship, we work to serve youth, young people who have been system engaged and the many outcomes of that. So that includes homelessness, that includes dropping out from school, and that includes issues with hunger and food access as well. But I would love for you to add more, Philip, if you have anything else.
Yeah, definitely. After you touched on a lot of valid points that the National Center for Youth Law looks at, as well as the Lived Experience Advocacy Fellowship looks at. The truth is in the title of the fellowship itself. We know that people with lived experience looks at issues through a different lens than say somebody who is traditionally trained through school. So we always try to listen to the voice of those communities. We also understand that there are different strides and strains that get put on communities that are experiencing these type of things. And when we look at overall social determinants of health, where we're looking at like equal access to education, equal access to healthcare, your lived and your built environments, this is a working order of things that lead to system involvement. And so with the work that we try to do, with the policy initiatives that we try to push, we try to take all these things into account, as well as bringing people in with lived experience.
Thank you all so much. Ben, I wanted to jump in a little bit more about Urban Peak. You mentioned the shelter, but I know that you all have a new facility, the mothership, and then are doing additional services. So there's shelter, but then there's other ways that people engage because not everyone would like to go to shelter, or that's not necessarily the fit for them. So sort of tell us a little bit more about how Urban Peak is addressing the issue at hand, and sort of what services you find work best for the specific group. I believe, do you all serve 14 to 24? Or was it 12 to 22 that you all serve? Oh, sorry, you are muted, Ben.
My fault. So now with the new building, we're actually able to go down to 12. So currently we still have not seen younger than a 14-year-old, but for the first time ever, we have lowered the age range. So yeah, before I get into that, thank you for that prompt as well. One thing I think I didn't really see on the slide that can add to youth unaccompaniment is just that kind of, and maybe it was in there, but just sort of the extreme family conflicts or some of the family problems that are leading youth to running away, and unaccompanied by choice. I mean, not by choice, but because they don't want to identify who their legal guardian or parent might be for fear of them, getting back in that dysfunctional home life or whatever. So a lot of our youth that end up at the shelter who are under 18, there is a big percentage that's coming from that extreme family conflict, and they're at the verge of running, or they're at the verge of being homeless because they're about to get kicked out, or they're running away from abuse or neglect. And so just kind of that's that beginning cycle, right, of folks that are running away from abuse, so they turn to the streets. And then a big part of what Urban Peak does is that prevention piece. If we can catch youth early on at this age, while there is those first mitigating factors that lead them to homelessness, we don't want them to to fall into the system and then end up becoming chronically homeless as an adult too. So we're trying to help in the early stages of the family conflict piece before they end up being, 29 years old and on the streets for 20 years. And I always say, like, anecdotally, you can ask so many adults on the street, like, how long have you been homeless for? And so many of them will say, like, since I was 16, man, ran away from, my alcoholic father or something like that. So we're trying to help those young folks at this age before they end up as adults. And so that's that's one of the really cool new things, segue into the new building, which we lovingly call the mothership. Christina, the CEO, just used that as kind of a placeholder. So some big foundation or something will come in and donate $10 million and call it the whatever center, and that didn't happen. And so somehow the mothership kind of stuck and always will, I think. And it's a great loving term that we use for it, but it really is this all-encompassing building that kind of provides all these supports in one big space. So rather than having youth go to different places, we kind of bring it all in-house. So as I was mentioning, one of the really exciting parts is that we now have a distinct separate space for kids under 18. So historically, Urban Peak, our shelter has been for 15 to 20-year-olds, but that is serving two different populations technically. You have youth who are under 18 who are minors, and 18, 19, and 20-year-olds who are adults. And so those are two kind of subsets of groups that we're working with. So 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, we're trying to help gain independent living skills, address education, employment, mental health, all those sort of things. Kids under 18, we're trying to figure out what's going on at home. Where are you going next? Like, nobody wants a 15-year-old living in a homeless shelter for longer than they need to. So we really try to focus on a 21-day program in terms of figuring out what's next for them. To start addressing some of the systematic issues on why they're in the homeless system. So now that we have a separate space just for kids under 18, what's the difference between a 14 and a 15-year-old, really, if we're talking about someone who needs emergency shelter, and then you could even argue that with a 13-year-old. 12 definitely sounds young. I have an 11-year-old, and so 12 definitely sounds really young, but some of our federal grants with Health and Human Services, is asking us to provide services for his youth as young as 12, because that, there are some 12-year-olds, unfortunately, who have that lived experience of, having to even step in and be a caretaker for younger siblings. So 12-year-olds sometimes has the life experience of like a 17-year-old, so but yes, we haven't had a 12-year-old give us a call yet, but we do have space for 12 to 17-year-olds now. On the other end, we have always worked with youth up to the age of 24, but because we had this shelter that only could work up to the age 20, the 21 to 24-year-olds historically don't have access to our overnight shelter. So they would just come to the drop-in center downtown and receive day services. So essentially it operated as like a day shelter. And then at night they would go to either the adult shelters or camp out on the street. So the exciting part about pulling the minors out of that space is now that we can actually provide shelter for our 21 to 24-year-olds. So also for the first time ever, we open up our doors to 21 to 24-year-olds, and we are at max capacity, and we're trying to open up the rest of the building because we didn't know if some of these youth 21 to 24 are going to want to stay in the shelter, or are they kind of ingrained in some of the street cultures, or staying with some of their folks on the street. But they have overwhelmingly wanted to come inside and stay at the new facility, and now we're trying to scale up faster than we were preparing for. But it is a really exciting building to where we're able to meet different needs just at that level. And I don't know how much time I have, so I don't want to hog the whole panel, but I do want to just also talk about our neighborhoods. So it's a 4-story building, and the second and the third floor we're calling neighborhoods, and these are still technically shelter beds, but it's non-congregate shelter. So it's kind of like they almost kind of look like college dorm suites, where you have a room that with roommates, and then there's a shared kitchen space and shared bathroom. I kind of even call them like little practice apartments too, because we're helping youth come into the emergency shelter, become stabilized, hopefully after not too long, a bed will open up in one of these neighborhoods, and then they move up into like non-congregate shelter, learn some more of those, hard skills, soft skills in terms of living independently, and then waiting for one of their independent housing options to open up, and then they'll move out of the mothership into their own permanent safe and stable exit or their own apartment, which they'll hopefully have some more of those independent life skills just by being in one of those neighborhoods. And so the neighborhoods are kind of grouped into these affinity groups. So we have right now we have transition living and independent living neighborhood open. So those youth that are working full time and have kind of like a pretty strong set of independent living skills to where they're just kind of waiting for the next apartment. And then we also have a newcomer neighborhood for a lot of our folks coming from out of the country that have been unfortunately had to stay in the shelter system. That was one thing as we're about to move into the shelter space. Almost half of our shelter, or like 30% of our shelter, were newcomer youth, and we didn't want to open up this new building at max capacity while we're also trying to invite 21 to 24-year-olds to come into the space. So we're trying to thin out some of the shelter, and we have their own neighborhood, which comes with specialized case managers that are bilingual and also can help them navigate the resources or the kind of the situation they're in terms of their next steps. And we've partnered with awesome agencies such as Remain, which is the Rocky Mountain Immigration Network. I can't remember exactly the advocacy network, and they do a great job in terms of helping those youth kind of move along in terms of accessing the systems. So we have 2 of the 6 neighborhoods open, and we're hoping to also have our maternity group home neighborhood open up, which is for young moms or parenting moms with young children or expecting moms, because that is such a huge need. And also just in terms of perpetuating the cycle of homelessness, if we can help these young moms with their kids be successful and kind of move into their own independence, that's only going to help those younger kids not be homeless. The saddest thing that I've heard over my 10 years at Urban Peak is having young people and their moms come in and say, "Oh, I used to stay here when I was a kid," and it's hard to still see that their kids are also struggling and needing that shelter space. So we're also kind of trying to end that cycle by providing some support to these young parenting teen moms, which as a dad, I mean, raising kids is hard at all the various levels. I can only imagine being young and without all the resources that I have currently. So also we want to have a neighborhood for youth aging out of foster care. So I know you mentioned that fostering youth independence and some of the recent money that came out in terms of helping those 18 to 21-year-olds youth transition into independence. And then also a recovery neighborhood for youth struggling with substances. And then something that we've seen a lot in our shelter space is youth with intellectual delays or cognitive delays, just developmental needs in terms of needing higher support. And the shelter system is very hard for them in terms of navigating the independence of a shelter when they really need kind of more support. And so this idea is almost kind of like a host home while they're waiting for a host home. So they'll have a lot more extra care and support with a life skill manager and case management in this kind of a setting until a more appropriate resource would open up. So yeah, that is our mothership. And then the 4th floor, I don't want to miss out on our well-being center. So 4th floor, we have our education and employment services. We have social emotional clinician as well as a counselor. We have access to therapy. We have a med clinic inside the shelter that also helps address youth, address their medical needs. We have a music studio. We have an art studio. And there's just really amazing, beautiful space up there. So I think overall, the most amazing part of the mothership not only is these services, but the amazing attention to detail in terms of the trauma-informed design that went into the space. And so looking at just the design of the building as an aid in service to these youth, because they walk in here and they see all this natural light and they see wood and just really beautiful space. And it almost kind of like helps the healing begin right away because it's just such a nice space. And so I know the architects did a lot of focus groups with staff and youth and have a lot of expertise in terms of designing space that doesn't feel institutional or like dark corners or weird lighting. And so it's very amazing just in that aspect alone.
Thank you so much, Ben. I think learning all that is so key because, we know that when we do these, we're actually next month going to do a session on outside Denver Metro. So this is an amazing resource in Denver, and just having this model for others to emulate is really great. And also just, the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless does serve youth, but it's not youth and young adults, but it's not our main arc. And, those neighborhoods you're speaking of, and the way that you're doing services, it's much the same as in adulthood. And so getting those independent living skills and having that happening upstream while the person is still younger is just so amazing to be able to have that.
Yeah. One more thing.
And
I'm sorry. I don't want to hog the
yeah.
whole presentation too. I want to highlight also the amazing work we're doing in the minor shelter as well, because like I was saying, if we're trying to help these youth upstream, one really amazing thing that we have noticed since we've really been able to like have this population in a separate space and really focus in on their needs, especially developmentally, like the biggest thing, huge, and I think this was in the slideshow, a big predicting factor for homelessness, especially as it affects youth, is just getting a GED or graduating high school. And I've heard folks that don't have a GED or graduate high school are like 108% more likely to be chronically homeless as an adult. So we really want to help these 15 and 16-year-olds be able to focus on school and really help try to support them navigate that and be successful as like a predicting factor of their own success, and trying to avoid the the likelihood they could become homeless if they choose not to, which it's hard when you in the old shelter when they're around 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, those are the kids they're hanging out with. So a lot of times they're like, oh, I don't want to go to school. I just want to get my own apartment and like get a job and all that sort of things. And I was like, you're only 15. Like you have your whole life to work and pay rent. Like you just need to focus on school and finish that out. So there was a couple of weeks where and we're still scaling up. So we're usually only around like 7 or 8 youth at a time, especially as it's a 21-day program. We're cycling youth in, trying to get them to another safe and stable exit within 21 days or a month. There was a couple of weeks where every one of our 7 or 8 kids was going to their school every day. And so that was something I hadn't seen in my tenure at Urban Peak, was all of our kids under 18 actually going to school. So I was very proud of that, just as one of those things that we're talking about. As a predicting factor. So we're really trying to focus on the schoolwork, obviously the family mediation and helping the adults and their parents, also being super empathetic to their situation. Raising teenagers right now is super hard. And so parents also really need somebody that can understand how hard it is to be a parent and let them kind of vent about their frustrations. And they also need support and resources as well, because if we're sending these kids back to a home where they don't have the resources and support that they're needed, like this kid isn't going to get what they need as well. So, I mean, we very see it as like a systematic, meso macro kind of level. Start with the immediate family, the schools, the community resources outside of that. We really want to help support all of those things when we're supporting our kids under 18.
Thank you so much, Ben. Philip, I wanted to talk to you because I know that you work very closely with justice-involved youth, and there's a strong correlation with homelessness. So, can you tell us a little bit about your work in the sector with justice-involved youth and preventing the school-to-prison pipeline?
Yeah, so I have an interesting role. The organization that I work with is an organization called Fully Liberated Youth, and our organization is a direct service organization that works with youth in both school-based and community-based. What I mean by community-based is our youth that are at risk of being thrusted into the justice system. So these youth are either on pretrial, diversion, or sometimes already on probation, or they're exiting the system. The second piece that we do is the school-based mentoring. The school-based mentoring is our way of like deflection or preventative work. And a great example I could give is when you have a mentor inside of a school who's working with the youth versus like an SRO. An SRO is trained to criminalize behaviors. So he's looking for ways to kind of write tickets and send kids home, whereas a mentor has a little more of an understanding of what's kind of going on with that youth overall with their life. There could be a lot of different things going on at home. We had a young person whose father was just released from the federal penitentiary and got deported back to Mexico and could be coming back. And so there's a lot of just different factors that are going in. And so with what work that we do, we look at preventative services through building relationships with youth. And so what those relationships also look like is not only just mentorship, but we do have a therapeutic arm. We do have a behavioral health arm. We do have licensed clinical social workers who are on staff, but we also have LPCs to kind of help address some of these things are. So what we're trying to do is not look at the forward-facing behavior, but looking at the undertones of what's kind of going on, right? And so that's the direct service work. That's doing the work on the ground in terms of working with the youth. When we look at system reform or true system reform, we're looking at it from a top-down and bottom-up approach. So our bottom-up approach is the direct service work. The top-down approach is the policy work. It's true policy reform that affect kids. So it's looking at decriminalizing adolescent behavior. It's looking at removing SROs, and it's looking at the way that we created the Call to Youth Justice Collaborative. This collaborative space is a collective think tank of organizers, system stakeholders, community-based organizations, licensed clinical social workers, and all of the sort, even lobbyists and lawyers. And so this particular space is a space where we create policy changes where either we're either brought an idea where a policy change is to be created, or we're bringing the policy change into this group. In this particular group, there are people who are writing the language of the bill, as well as providing technical assistance for the bill. So that could be things in terms of reaching out to the community to find community members with lived experience and inviting them out to the Capitol to give their testimony, but not only give their testimony, give them support to get their testimony on paper. It's giving individuals like myself with lived experience just the opportunity to be in this space and understand what the policy work looks like, as well as numerous media opportunities that I've had to be able to kind of share my story and give my insight onto why these different policy measures kind of need a change. And so I'm lucky enough to be in a good position where not only do I get to look at the policy, right, and be involved in that work and organize according to that work and look at the language of the bill, participate in that, but I also have a small caseload of kids. I'm a director on our team, but our directors are we hold a minimum of at least 7 kids on our caseload that we work with, and so I have kids who are community-based that are on diversion or probation, but I also mentor kids within inside the school. And so I'm also at Manual. And so we're looking at this in twofold. And so it's change is hard and change is long, right? It's not something that happens overnight. And one of the policy measures that we have been looking at with reducing justice involvement for youth, which just means we're trying to raise the age at which a child can be charged with the crime. And right now we're trying to raise that to 12, and it sits at 10. We have been pushing this policy for the last 3 years, and unfortunately, it just hasn't. It's gotten some leeway, and it's gotten pretty far, but it hasn't passed yet. And so that's when I first came on into the work, is looking at some of that work. And so we understand that change is hard and change is long, but that's how we look at decreasing the overrepresentation of Black and Brown and Indigenous youth within the justice system as a whole. From the top down through policy reform, and from the bottom up through direct service work, through the work that we do, both school-based and both community-based.
Thank you so much, Philip. I see you nodding, Ashley. So I definitely want to check in with you and also mention that, you're a Leaf Fellow for the National Center for Youth Law, but you also do other roles here locally as a young adult. You sound incredibly busy when I was looking at your info. So as someone who's, sort of within this community that we're talking about as a young adult, like what maybe do you have to share? What have you learned in your many roles? What have you learned personally as someone sort of in that age area?
Yeah, of course. So the majority of my work has focused on young people who are system engaged, and specifically on the school to prison pipeline. And I've had the opportunity of working at a charter school as a board director. And one of the things that has worked best for our youth to prevent them from being system engaged and to prevent them from being unhoused is creating specialized educational plans for them, and that work best for them. We also have a huge emphasis on restorative justice and operating within our school with the restorative justice lens and focus. And as Philip was talking, there are just so many things running through my head. One of the things that I think is really important to really acknowledge and understand about how policies impact youth is that so far alone this year, as of the 15th, there have been 51 10-year-olds arrested in the state of Colorado for different things, for most prominently crimes against people, property, and society. And the majority of those young people who are arrested for these crimes are arrested in their schools. They're referred by their schools. They're impacted because of their schools. And so something that's really important when it comes to the school to prison pipeline is that we have the ability to change that. We have the ability to prevent that. And we also have the power and resources to ensure that no more 10, 11, and 12-year-olds are arrested within schools and on school property. So yeah, there was just so many things that Philip was saying that not only resonated with me, but I think are really important to acknowledge when it comes to young people who are system engaged. The majority of young people who are system engaged and that are referred through the school to prison pipeline are people with disabilities, people of color, and they are people who have issues that are not being acknowledged by or with their schools. So by working more collaboratively with students, with any familial relations that they have, you can not only prevent this system, but you could also ensure that they have a likelihood of going into higher education. When a young person, I know that we are all familiar with this, but when a young person is unhoused, they will continue to face those challenges throughout the rest of their life. They have more likelihood of not being able to get housing later on. They have more likelihood of not being able to access education as easily. And especially when a young person is both system engaged and has been unhoused, that could impact whether or not they get housing in higher education. So even when young people can supersede those issues don't get to leave them, unfortunately. If you are charged with a crime as a young person, it can make it much more difficult for you to get a job. And you not being able to get a job can make it much more difficult for you to pay your restitution. And the majority of people who face issues after being unhoused or becoming unhoused is because of restitution. It's because of paying court fees. It's because of paying fees for restorative justice things. So I think there are a lot of different subject matters and issues that come into this topic. And I know I specifically come with a focus when it comes to the school to prison pipeline, but I think it's just one of the most, for me, prevalent ways in which a young person can become unhoused in the first place. And so by preventing a young person from being involved in the justice system in the first place, we can prevent a whole cycle of living life in a much more difficult way, because there are solutions to this and there are ways in which we can prevent this. And there are ways to ensure that no 10-year-old is arrested in this day and age.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Sarah, I want to turn to you. Thank you for your patience. Your organization, the Colorado Children's Campaign, sort of works in big picture of impacted youth and legislation. I know that both Philip and Ashley were also talking about legislative issues. And so are there things that you found to be impactful in the past, some like wins and impactful legislation you've had, and then, maybe something on the horizon for next year? I know leg session is just around the corner, though you hate to hear it. So yeah, tell us about what's maybe available and possible this year.
Yeah, sure. And it's been really great to hear from everybody about the great work that you're all doing on the ground. So this has been really incredible. I think similar to what both Philip and Ashley were talking about, one of the areas that we think a lot about when we're doing our work to support child well-being, and especially with kids who are in the K-12 system, is those school settings. We know that that's a place where kids spend a lot of their time. We also, I'll just note that there were about 20,000 kids identified as homeless through the Colorado Department of Education. So that's using a little bit broader definition. A lot of those kids are not unsheltered, but those do include unaccompanied youth. So we know there are a lot of kids in our school system who are already experiencing homelessness who need supports. But overall, I think one of the big wins that we have seen in the past few years is some work around what we call school climate. So it's sort of like what it feels like to be in school and whether it's a place where youth feel safe and like they belong. And so I think, to the points Philip and Ashley were making about the presence of SROs in school, restorative justice, some of those things that either work for or against a positive school climate is something we think about a lot. And a few years ago, a bill was passed that required districts to put out some profile reports to show along different indicators how school climate looks from school to school, district to district across the state. Those profile reports were just published for the first time this year. So it's sort of the first crack at those reports coming out, but you can see them on the Department of Education's website now, and we're looking forward to, making sure people are taking a look at those, but also continuing to improve those data as we move forward, because we think it's going to be really important for people to be able to see those things and then also think about ways to improve school climate based on what we're seeing in those reports. Something else I can mention that was a win is just this past legislative session, there was a huge change to an update to our school finance formula. So the math problem that determines how dollars are distributed to districts and schools across our state. And it's a really big deal. It hadn't been updated in a very long time. And luckily now that formula has been updated and more money is going to go to schools based on students who are categorized as at risk. That's the language that's used in the formula. And that includes students who are identified as experiencing homelessness. So that's one really great way that we're going to hopefully start to get more resources to schools based on their student population and what they need. I think one other thing I'll mention, and this is, like I said earlier, we really do think about oftentimes child well-being in the context of families. And with families, oftentimes it's about income and it's economic supports that are really making it difficult for families to stay stably housed or if they're experiencing homelessness. And so I think in the past few years, we've seen some incredible wins around tax credits that are going to be available to families who are low income to put more money directly in their pockets and just help with the overwhelming cost of living in Colorado, the fact that incomes aren't keeping up with that, the fact that many families are housing cost burdened, many families aren't making ends meet. And so we're really excited to see some of those tax credits become available now for a lot of those families. I think you asked what's sort of coming up in the coming legislative session that is, you're right, just around the corner. A few things. So just talked about the school finance formula. One of the things that's going to be really important this upcoming session is to make sure that turns on. So it has to be implemented. It passed last session, and we're going to be working to make sure that actually gets up and running this session. It's going to be huge for kids and schools across the state. One other thing I'll mention is there's going to be work to figure out how to make sure that we can adequately fund our Healthy School Meals for All program. That was a ballot measure that passed a few years ago. It means kids at school are getting universal school meals, and that is an amazing thing. And we've got to figure out the funding a little bit around that. And so people are thinking and working hard to get that figured out. And that's going to be something that's going to have to happen this upcoming session. And then the last thing I'll mention around school discipline, and this ties in a little bit to what Philip and Ashley were talking about as well. There was a task force on school discipline policies in public schools that was formed a couple of years ago. They have put out a report with some recommendations around school discipline practices and policies in schools. And I think it's likely that some of those recommendations are going to move forward this session to hopefully improve the way those things look in our schools across the state for different groups of kids who are often disproportionately impacted by discipline policies and actions in their schools. So I'll leave it there, but that's just a few things that we're thinking about.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This one's question for anyone. We want to talk about sort of solutions, and I know that's come and gone in the conversation, but what do you all see as some of the largest preventative factors of homelessness in teens and youth, upstream initiatives, programs and projects, either that you work on or that maybe you've seen somewhere else in another state, in another area that you think, we would like to add and implement here, and that's for whomever would like to jump in.
I feel like I've been talking too much already, but yeah, for me, kind of like I was saying in terms of the preventative approach, just like looking at each individual youth like holistically, like there's so many things that go into these youth that could really help prevent, kind of the topic we're talking about. So in terms of the schools that they go to and how they're treated at school, which could lead like all the way down to them getting in trouble in the system. And then like once you're in the system, it can be so hard to get out, to, focusing on relationships with parents or caregivers in terms of just like those sort of resources. Kids have to navigate so many different social things with their friends and so many pressures, not to mention, drugs, alcohol, everything else. So really just trying to look at each individual youth and having somebody paying attention to all those different things and helping provide kind of like that holistic approach and trying to help them with addressing all those needs. Because yeah, there's so many different reasons collectively where our youth can end up in these situations. And so yeah, just I guess it's up to all of us to keep an eye on these youth, also point them in the right direction, know all the resources. Such as Urban Peak. And Urban Peak, we rely on a lot of other folks as well in terms of how we refer parents, families, caregivers in terms of making sure they're getting the help that they need.
Yeah, I can just to add to that, a few other things I think are important and thinking about the school setting are things like school-based health centers and mental health professionals in schools. And we know there are definitely not enough mental health professionals in our schools. And in particular, I think kids who are really struggling and facing a lot of other barriers, those can be really critical supports in schools that can be really preventative. And so that's one thing. And then I think making sure when kids, if they are identified in school as experiencing homelessness, sort of under that definition, making sure those kids are able to get, effectively connected to all the services that they're legally entitled to, because of that is really important too.
I would agree. Something really unique, or something that I believe is really unique that my school provides for our youth and their families, is we have a relief program. So any family who needs support with paying rent, or even if they need something like a new laundry machine, that is something that we have funding set up for families to provide them with that additional support. I think in general, it also the criminal justice system, and I know I'm speaking predominantly from that perspective, needs to reform the way that it views justice-involved youth. Oftentimes, justice-involved youth are seen as criminals, they're seen as delinquents. And the majority of the time, young people who engage in the system have a valid reason for engaging in that system. So when we actually begin to tackle the real issues at hand, whether that be poverty, homelessness, not having access to food at home, we can actually begin to help young people, prevent them from being in the system, prevent them from engaging in homelessness. There are no valid reasons that I've seen so far or interact with so far to not help young people through a restorative justice lens. It tends to be more effective for everyone involved in a system. And when we can truly begin to look at young people who are justice engaged more holistically, like the young people that they are, then we can help them. We can prevent them from continuing to be engaged, and we can prevent them from becoming the stereotypes that we place on them.
Thank you all so much. Last pre-planned question we have is one that we tend to do. It's not quite a magic wand question, but it is sort of, for people who have joined tonight, and those who are going to watch it later. Many work in the sector. Some people are just individuals who are interested in the topic and here today. For those who want to assist neighbors, impact policies, help the youth that they know or don't know in their neighborhoods, what do you recommend that community members do to impact that change? Though, of course, if you have $10 million for the mothership, that's the first part. But beyond that, any others?
Yeah, that would be great. No, kind of like what I was saying. I mean, just in terms of if you ever run into a young person or, could be a family member or just somebody. So knowing the resources, knowing kind of some of the questions to ask, just being curious about things that might draw concern, asking questions, and then knowing kind of the right direction to point them to, if it's urban peak, if it's somewhere specific to those sort of needs. So I think just being attentive to youth and their needs, and kind of pointing them in the right direction, just simply put.
I want to echo what you said and sort of build on it a bit. So definitely listen to youth, give them the resources that you have, support them, and then also uplift them and their experiences and their stories. I've had the wonderful pleasure and opportunity to work with a young person who has been just as involved, unhoused, and now has aspirations of running for office one day. So young people are amazing and their experiences don't define them. And if we can encourage them to truly live in their expertise, live in their intellect, they can do amazing things.
Yeah, it was really well said.
I'll go ahead and jump in. I suspect Sarah would say the same thing, but advocating. Philip was talking about folks going in legislative session and being part of lobby days. Please join any of the organizations listed on here, or look up the type of services that are interesting to you. And we have an advocacy network at CCH. I know the Colorado Children's Campaign also does a lot of advocating. And so please join and make your voice heard. It really does make a difference, especially if you are part of the population who's impacted, to be there and have your voice heard. So always a plug we will add here from CCH. I want to ask one of the questions that we got from Jimmy in our Q&A. The question is, how do you facilitate minors and parents? Do the parents have to give consent? I'll build on that a bit to say, are there differences in the way that you think that we have to address the issue with young adults and youth, and sort of are there situations where parents are helpful and then also situations where they're not, and so how do you navigate that in your organizations, knowing that there's going to be that push and pull of everyone comes to homelessness in different ways and for different reasons, and so how do you deal with that lens on? And that's for anyone.
Yeah, and I can just jump in really quick. Yeah, it can be challenging, and really for us to be successful, like we need the parent to want to see a positive change, and that's the hardest thing, is if the parent is just at a point where they don't know what to do and they're not even really wanting to receive help, that's the hardest part. But getting consent for youth to stay here, starts upon just building that relationship and helping the parents know, like, we're here to help, like, we can understand you have your own set of things that you would like support with. So helping explain to, like, young people's parents, like, we're here to help support you as well. We want to help introduce you to resources, like validating that raising teenagers right now is super hard for them as well, and just really trying to help advocate for their needs as well as a parent. Yeah, and just like legally, I mean, we are a runaway shelter, so we want youth to come to us if they're running away. So we're trying not to scare them off. However, at the end of the day, like, legally, you know, we have to at least try to get consent within 72 hours, or we do need to reach out to, child services. And so we have ways of doing that to where we're not going to scare the youth off. But there might be a parent at home that's like terrified, not knowing where their children is, and if we're not doing our due diligence trying to at least find them, that's what we want to try to avoid. So really it's just that relationship piece with parents in terms of trying to help them understand we're also here trying to help them. And then I think for so many of our youth, like, their situation really isn't going to get better unless we can help make that home environment better too. And if the home environment, like I was saying, if the parents just like, nope, I'm done, then are there any other caring adults in your life we could talk about you staying with? So many of our youth are those 17, almost 18-year-olds, and the parents are just like, just wait until they're 18. But I mean, there's other, hopefully, relatives, caregivers, potential places where they could stay until they are 18, and then they can kind of build on their independence that way.
Thanks, Ben. And I'll say that I know that family reunification is a thing that we do here at the coalition. For instance, at our recuperative care center, we're talking about people who may be in their 40s or 60s, and family reunification doesn't have to be a parent. It has to be, someone who's a family or friend who you can be with. And I think oftentimes that gets lost. And so thank you so much for bringing that up.
Yeah.
We're getting to the end, so just an opportunity for anyone to share anything we missed before we close out tonight, if anyone would like to add anything. Okay, I won't force you. Okay. Well, Andrew, if you could throw up those last couple slides. I just want to thank our panelists tonight. I think it was a really wonderful, robust conversation that we had. And covered this well. I know that we have covered families before, but being able to speak to this special population is really great. And we know that these folks need different programs and different assistance than is always offered. So thank you to our amazing panelists. Thank you to the education and advocacy team here at the coalition for helping out. And then thank you so much to our attendees. We know that it is a Thursday night and it's almost Halloween, and this is how you've chosen to spend your evening, is learning with us. So thank you all so much. We will have our last session of the year next month. It'll be really talking about Beyond Metro Denver, homelessness across Colorado. So we often get feedback that people would like to know more about what homelessness looks like and homelessness response services look like outside of Denver Metro, where the coalition is primarily located. So we're going to cover that next month. Please do join us. Please also take the survey as you exit or when we send our follow-up email tomorrow. That really helps to inform what we plan, and we're going to start planning for 2025. And so, what do you want to learn more about? Who do you want to hear from? Who are we not representing? Please let us know and we'll build that in. So thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Philip. Thanks, Ashley. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Sarah.